In little over a decade, the online revolution has connected and changed the world we live in. More than a convenience for individuals, the internet has become a practical necessity for businesses and governments that use it to carry out communications, big and small, every minute of every day. With all this dependence on a wired world has also come a new kind of vulnerability, as virtual attacks in cyberspace can and do pose a very real danger to national security. This is a threat that defense experts are taking increasingly seriously. And as you will see in this next report, it's a threat that recently became a frightening reality for one U.S. ally. When you think about countries in the world that might be the target of a massive attack, the tiny Baltic state of Estonia is probably not high on the list. This is Tallinn, the capital of Estonia. It's one of the best preserved cities in Northern Europe, with architecture that dates to medieval times. The Estonians have had a long history of being occupied by the Danes, the Nazis, and especially by the Russians. Estonia is a former Soviet satellite state that regained its independence in 1991. The people here consider themselves more Scandinavian than Russian. Helsinki is only 37 miles away across the Gulf of Finland, and their relationship with Russians? It's a lot like the climate here much of the year, frosty. Well, how would you describe relations between Estonia and Russia at the moment?
Well, I think we were this spring, we were the flavor of the month, or more maybe the flavor of the semester. It seems that every half year you need someone new to bash.
Toomas Hendrik Ilves is the Swedish-born, American-educated president of Estonia. His parents, Estonian refugees, fled to Stockholm to avoid Soviet prison camps in World War II. Ilves received his undergraduate and graduate degrees from Ivy League schools and lived in the United States for most of his life. Well, in your view, what can be done to improve relations between Russia and Estonia?
I think perhaps a period of just cooling off and not really not paying attention to events until after the presidential elections, because it's becoming quite clear that a lot of rhetoric is being whipped up.
The rhetoric from Russia has been more than just talk. It all began with a statue called the Bronze Soldier, a memorial to the Soviet Red Army.
It was a statue erected in 1947 to celebrate the, quote, liberation of Estonia. Unfortunately, most Estonians don't see it as a liberation, since my country, like Poland, like Latvia, like Lithuania, we were all invaded by the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union was an ally of Nazi Germany. We don't really view the Soviet Union as a liberator, and really don't see any moral difference between what the Nazis did in our country and what the Soviets did in our country.
So the Estonian government decided to move the statue from a prominent place in the capital to a war cemetery on the outskirts of the city.
The monument to the Red Army veterans, which was in the middle of the capital, had great symbolic value for both sides in this debate.
Professor Yanni Kasonis is an authority on Russian history at New York University.
On the one hand, from the point of view of Russians, it was the legacy of the Soviet era and part of what gave them a place inside Estonia. From their point of view, this was one of the last remaining tangible legacies of that era, and therefore of immediate relevance to their own identities. So it had great symbolic value. From the point of view of Estonians, it meant exactly the same thing, which is to say a legacy of the Soviet period, and for this reason, fit to be expunged. Occupying the central place in the capital was irksome to many, because it was a constant, everyday reminder, and also a sort of aesthetic reminder and a geographic reminder of a past that many would sooner forget.
So even though the Estonians wanted to forget the past, a quarter of the population is ethnic Russian. The statue also marked the burial ground for 12 Red Army soldiers. When the government decided to move the statue, well, it was not exactly welcome news in the Russian community. For 2 days and nights last April, young Russians high on nationalism took to the streets of Tallinn, destroying property and defying police. More than 800 protesters were arrested. One of the protesters, a young Russian man we'll call Alex, says he didn't take part in the violence, but he could sense it was going to be a bloody night. He didn't want his face shown on camera.
The people, they became more angry and angry and angry, and they started fighting. It was physical fight. It was throwing the stones. You can see it on the video, how it was happening. The police, they ran into the crowd. They took some peoples, and other peoples that were in this crowd, they were going to the street. It was very bloody this day. Not only to people, to police also, as I know.
But after the riots came the real attack, a massive electronic bombardment on a scale never seen before. Despite its medieval architecture, what's behind these old stone walls is an infrastructure that's far ahead of most of the Western world. Estonia has become one of the most wired societies on Earth.
It was our key to rapid development. When we emerged out of the miasma that was the Soviet Union and we had lost 50 years of development, then what we thought was that we would put a lot of effort into the one area where everyone was on a level playing field, and that was computerization. So very rapidly, all Estonian schools are on the internet. We have more services on the internet than just about any country has. 98% of bank transactions take place on the internet.
The lives of everyday Estonians depend on the internet. From e-banking, e-commerce, e-schools, e-ID cards to e-voting. More than 3/4 of Estonians file their tax returns on the internet. Then suddenly one day last May, that wired world went dark. On May 9th at midnight, Moscow time, millions of signals sent from a swarm of network computers hijacked from around the world, in countries as far away as China, Vietnam, Malaysia, Egypt, and here in the United States, suddenly launched a cyber attack aimed to knock down the entire country.
Many analysts say that this was the first cyber attack targeted in a very concrete time period against one country.
Linar Vik is Estonia's internet pioneer and a former advisor to the government.
The most important is that leaders of Estonia, but also other countries, realize that cyber threat is a real threat. It impacts not something in the internet, bits and zeros. It's not computers which fight to each other. It's an issue of your regular daily life around you.
Internet sites that normally get 1,000 hits a day were suddenly getting hundreds of thousands of hits per second. The whole country of Estonia was being electronically jammed.
At any given moment, maybe the 500,000 computers were addressing Estonian servers, and this exceeded the normal flow of information 10,000 times.
Jaak Aaviksoo is the Estonian defense minister.
Over hours and on several days, of course, the e-banking system was down and the news. But since, say, more than 90% of all bank transactions in Estonia are done via internet, so you can imagine that it influenced quite a big number of people, and including myself also in later days.
May 9th marked the height of what was unfolding to be a massive cyber offensive that, according to President Ilves, could only have originated from one place. Is there any doubt in your mind that it came from Russia?
There's no proof exactly where it can come from because computers can be hijacked from all over the place, but if it's timed almost to the hour as to certain political events in your country, it makes you think it's probably not Nepal that's doing it.
May 9th, it turns out, is an important day in Russian history.
May 9th in Russia continues to be marked as the anniversary of the victory over Nazi Germany. 20 to 30 million deaths were evidence that this war was won primarily by the Soviet Union, and it was very much entrenched in the historical memory of those who were raised after that.
I don't think there's any doubt in anyone's mind where it came from, especially since there have been some people who in the Russian cyberspace have boasted about being involved in this. It's beyond a reasonable doubt.
I see very, very big similarities with terrorism. What they wanted to achieve was instability, to increase instability among ordinary people and expect that this instability turns against the government, or not in charge, he's not able to guarantee the normal situation.
The increase in online activity seemed to echo that of a mob, says Hilar Arlad, head of Estonia's Computer Emergency Response Team.
Here it's actually started.
Within hours, all of Estonia's computer systems, from the police department to newspapers, were under attack. It lasted for over 3 weeks.
It was pretty much clear that we can call it everybody in Estonian internet is hit. Private sector, TV channels, newspapers, banking sector, different IT companies, you name it. Public sector, parliament, government, prime minister, president, Ministry 1, Ministry 2, so on.
A computer expert described the amount of data blasted at Estonia servers as equivalent to downloading a full version of a Windows operating system every 6 seconds for 10 hours. The cyber attacks that targeted Estonia may have been politically motivated, but the impact was felt all down the line, at times seriously interrupting the Estonians' daily routine. Suddenly, there was no way to access information online, like bank accounts. And without computers, everyday purchases like milk and bread became all but impossible.
Every single product has a barcode, and you have a lot of barcode readers and girls whose barcode readers working on the cashier line. So you know exactly how many milk and bread you have, but it's all dependent on computers and internet.
They were public sites, but they were affecting the life of so many citizens and so many public offices that it was clearly an issue of national security, and that was why it was also in the attention of the Minister of Defense.
The defense minister also says the government is wired to the max. Estonia's e-government is completely wireless. The cabinet convenes in an all-digital environment where the Prime Minister's laptop is marked by a traditional gavel and flag. And it, too, became a target when government officials were suddenly flooded with threatening emails.
I could even call it a propaganda war, which is run by Russia against Estonia during the last several months, or even a little bit more.
Marko Mikkelson, the chairman of the Parliamentary Commission on European Affairs.
There were thousands of emails actually with the same sort of text, which were obviously sort of transmitted in a web and in internet in Russia. And but there were some very specific ones where they also used the language of threatening, politicians, also saying that, yeah, we come and we get you and you have to pay for this, what you have done with your life.
In addition to threatening emails, government websites were defaced with politically charged images, causing a total shutdown of these interactive sites.
The internet site of the ministry, this was basically closed for weeks. This was made from a dynamic, interactive website to a static website to protect it from attacks.
Also in Estonia May 9th was American Bill Woodcock, who is one of the leading experts in internet routing.
In attacks like this, the ability to respond quickly is really paramount.
Woodcock and an elite team of IT experts had to work fast to try to electronically wall off Estonia from the rest of the world.
Knowing who to call and having them take your call on the first try and having them act upon it immediately without having to establish your credentials and explain what's going on and so forth is really important.
It didn't take the response teams long to figure out this was a broad-scale attack that was using hijacked computers from all over the world. Dean Turner is Director of Global Intelligence for Symantec, one of America's largest computer security companies.
Criminals have taken the time now to know that, well, this thing called the internet, the web provides them with high levels of anonymity. It's decentralized, it's globalized. You could be located in Timbuktu, targeting a company located in the United States, going through a server that's located in France.
This attack was atypical in that a large portion of the traffic, nearly a quarter at some points in the attack, was coming from infected machines in the United States, which don't have very much bandwidth associated with them. That made it an ineffective attack in some ways if you just look at the effect on the network. But it also provided an interesting kind of plausible deniability in that if you ask the Russians what the source of the attack is, they can say, oh, well, obviously, it wasn't coming from us, it was coming from the United States.
According to Alex, Russian bloggers called for the cyber attacks to retaliate against Estonian police action in the protests.
I know this, yes, something about this. I saw it even by myself on the forums, Russian forums. It was people who said, so come on, let's make this. And let's make these cyber attacks. I don't think that's the part of the Russian government. I think that the reason of these cyber attacks was the riots, was the police action in Tallinn, because all Russian people saw what happened here in the news, Russian news. That's why they made it.
We spoke to the Russian embassy, and they denied any participation in the attacks. But NATO is not taking this matter lightly. We'll have that part of the story for you next. The plot of ground that contained the Soviet War Memorial in Estonia's capital is covered in flowers today. While tensions still bubble beneath the surface, the Estonians, now members of NATO, want to find out who was behind it. And could another country be brought to its knees by a sophisticated network of hackers? But the Prime Minister and the State Prosecutor's Office are pointing fingers directly at the Russian government, saying some of the computers used in the attacks had internet addresses linked to the Kremlin.
In recent times, there have been efforts orchestrated through the Kremlin, but with a lot of support in civil society as a whole, to give certain foundations to a strong patriotic movement of Russians. There's this blurry area, in other words, and you can't quite tell if this is inside the state or outside the state. Recently, there's been efforts to set up this pro-Kremlin, specifically pro-Putin and pro-Russian youth movement, Nashi, which means ours. But this is an extension of this bigger movement, which is that a movement which emphasizes buying Russian goods, emphasizes, or specifically Russian experience.
The Estonians and others in Europe are becoming increasingly concerned about the situation in Russia. All the hope and promise of a real democracy in Russia just a few years ago has been replaced by a growing fear of President Vladimir Putin and what Europeans see as his bellicose leadership.
Russians have historically looked at Estonia as part of their empire. Estonia becomes an independent country, from the point of view of many Russians, is temporary. It's an interruption in what should have been the case, which is that Estonia is part of Russia.
If you have a country of 1.3 million on one side, and on the other side you have 143 million, then I think I think the onus lies on the bigger side. Estonia, like a number of other countries, actually represents a counterexample to the ideology of managed democracy. The idea that because of the Soviet experience, the rules of democracy shouldn't apply to Russia, and that freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and so forth are sort of unnecessary parts of democracy. But countries like Estonia or Poland or Georgia show that, in fact, you could have had communist rule for a long time, but if you get rid of it, you can, in fact, enjoy freedom of speech and rule of law. And that's a disturbing factor to many people, and I think that's the main cause of it.
Russian blogs gave detailed instructions on how to attack and overload Estonia's websites. The hackers were using so-called botnets. That's when an unauthorized user takes control over hundreds, thousands, or up to 1 million computers by remote control. The effect can be crippling. Meanwhile, in Estonia, the government is looking to write new laws to punish cyber criminals. The issue of cybersecurity is something President Ilves doesn't take lightly.
If in the past people were connected by sea lanes and trade routes, then today we are ever more connected by the internet.
Let's talk about cybersecurity. How does cybersecurity figure into your national defense?
Well, since last April, a lot more, since we came under massive cyber attacks. Basically what happened was that many of our computer systems were shut down by attacks from outside Estonia. It's not unique, it's happened before, but never on a scale like this. Just as the U.S. Defense Department's computers have been attacked, and as it turns out, several ministries have come under a computer attack, we now had it on a broader scale. But the real issue is legal. We need to really get a firm and strong set of laws.
Which we do not now have.
We do not have this at this point. And that's something that I think we can undertake together in NATO, in the European Union, and something I discussed at length with President Bush in the beginning of this summer, and with a number of people and leaders in the European Union. And I think there is growing consensus now that this is a serious issue.
In this old Soviet building is the Estonian military's Communications Training Center, which is now being transformed into a state-of-the-art cyber defense center in conjunction with NATO.
We actually were engaged in building this before we experienced our cyber attacks. But now, as a result of the real increase in cyber attacks in the past year, not only in Estonia, but within the NATO family, that awareness has really risen, especially in the military, which is very often focused on more lethal military kinds of attacks and defense. That in fact all of your defenses could be rendered null and void by streams of electrons.
The age of the internet and the virtual age allows for fighting without fighting. It was difficult to pin responsibility on any one institution because it didn't happen from one institution. It happened by all the hackers spread out across the Russian Federation, and even Russians who are outside of Russia.
And remember Alex? He says don't be surprised if there are more cyber attacks to come.
Next year.
Most likely, he thinks, on May 9th.
Right now, we just don't talk about this with our Estonian friends, with our Estonian colleagues. Maybe next year it could be another cyber attack and other protest.
A few weeks ago, the Estonian government charged foreign activists, all part of pro-Putin youth organizations, with organizing the protests that led to the riots. But the government also accused the Kremlin of financing not only the riots in the streets, but also the electronic attacks that crippled a young country. If you have questions or comments, send us an email. The address is viewer@hd.net.